Hi, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. This is episode 9. Are you ready to jump right in? All right. We're going to start off with a question from Brad from Georgia. They say, recently I was reading about patient SM who had no functional amygdala. In an interview with her as an adult, she was asked when she remembered experiencing fear. She said that when she was 3 to 4 years old, but not since. Can you tell me what the neurological pathway is to her remembering what fear is, but not having experienced it in so long?
Yes, patient SM, fascinating to give some background on her. So the amygdala, there's two amygdalae, one on each side, are central to fear, anxiety, aggression, all of that. And SM suffers from this extremely rare disease, so rare that I'm not even sure if I've ever pronounced it correctly. Urbach-Witte disease, let's say. Urbach-Witte, Urbach-Witte, something, no doubt. Urbach was the one who discovered it's possible to get damage to the left amygdala, and Witte discovered possible to the right, and they met at an amygdala club. So now we've got their syndrome. SM has this rare calcification disorder where the amygdalae in her brain, amygdalae, were destroyed. You look at a brain image of it, it's astonishing in terms of it just being the amygdalas. So, in principle, this is someone who is incapable of feeling fear, anxiety, and that's certainly what it looks like in a broad kind of way. She recognizes all sorts of facial expressions appropriately, except for angry ones. She does not respond physiologically to something. Scary movies do not scare her. She finds them curious. In some weird way, she sort of generalizes emotionally scary stuff as being curious. Her kids talk about how she'll just like leap out of the car and pick up a snake that you see on the side of the road without like any hesitation. So she has very little fear. She doesn't read fearful facial expressions, any of that stuff, which is utterly fascinating. It's utterly fascinating in all sorts of ways. One is that interesting thing about her facial processing that doesn't work right. And this is the work of this neurologist, Antonio Damasio at USC, who has studied her, and he's one of the gods of sort of behavioral neuroscience. So she looks at faces, she could recognize, okay, that's a happy face, that's a sad face. Frightening, angry face doesn't register in the slightest. And they did this study where they did some eye tracking stuff, and they noticed when people typically look at a face in the first fraction of a second, milliseconds, you look at the eyes. You look at the eyes, and second, the mouth, this sort of triangle of that's where you get your information from emotionally. And what's remarkable is she doesn't look there. And so she's looking at the nose, she's looking off of the corners, just randomly bopping around all over the place. So, oh, that's interesting. She doesn't look at the most informative part of the place for facial expressions. And then what they showed was when they instructed her, look at the eyes of each of these people, her accuracy at detecting a frightened face went up to normal. What's cool about that? Two things. First off, you need to be looking here into somebody's soul to pick up that they're scary looking, but she doesn't need that to pick up happy, sad, quizzical, so on. And for me, the more amazing thing is, whoa, she doesn't have anything wrong with her eye muscles or something. It's her amygdala in there. What do the amygdalas do? Partially what they do is decide I'm scared, I'm anxious, emotional responsiveness. But part of what they're doing is sending messages to her eye muscles, telling her what sort of sensory information to acquire. In a fraction of a second, her ocular motor muscles and a cranial nerve doing that. Her amygdala is saying, when you look at a face, look at or all of our amygdalas are saying, look at the eyes first, because that's really important. What's a part of your brain doing, telling your eyes where to look? This is a general theme. We think of like our periphery, our ears, our eyes, or all of that solely sending information to the brain. But the brain is changing the thresholds of all the stuff out there in the way that if you were very hungry, changes happen in your olfactory system thanks to your brain directing it so that you get more attuned to the smell of food and stuff. So that's part of the picture going on with her, which is, absolutely extraordinary. In terms of that, what's life like without being able to feel afraid of something? She is very vulnerable. She is pathologically over-trusting. In an economic game, she can't detect that somebody else is stabbing her in the back, whereas everybody would say, that bastard, and shift their gameplay. She doesn't do that. That she's very vulnerable in that regard. So back to this issue of why does she remember that she was scared of things? Does she remember fear, or does she remember there was the time that I felt fear? My guess is more the latter. She was not born with this disease. It developed over time. So she certainly had experiences with fear when she was younger. And this tells you something. The amygdala is not necessarily where you store your fear memories, although that's been controversial for years, people screaming at each other. But at the very least, the more abstracted version of the fear memory is somewhere else. So much like HM, this guy who had his hippocampi taken out, he never formed a long-term memory again. He remembered everything from beforehand. Seemingly, SM, if she is not remembering the emotional memory, she could at least remember there was a time I was feeling fear back when.
Your description, it made me wonder a little bit about potential similarities between people with amygdala damage and Williams syndrome in terms of lack of processing of non-friendliness, essentially.
Yes, yes, and I sure hope somebody asks about Williams syndrome so we have an excuse to talk more about that and why dogs genetically have something resembling Williams syndrome, which is why they're so. Anyway, yes, for the future.
All right, next, Theo from Schleswig-Holstein asks, on what do you base your asseveration that we are the only species to be aware of our ineluctable demise?
Whoa, well, that vocabulary puts the rest of us, I pikers who are native English speakers, we salute you. That was my statement. We're the only species that knows we're going to die someday. You know, I got to fess up. I can't prove that. It just seems highly unlikely that there's any other species. So, like, you got me. Some species have a sense of future, which is remarkable. Corvids, which are like jays and one of the other ones, ravens, and they are so smart. They're unbelievably smart crows as well, that they could plan for the future. You take a crow and you feed them on days 1 through 5, etc., and you don't feed them on days 2, 4, 6, and on days 1 through 5, you give them a ton of food, and they eat their fill, and then they hide more of it because they know tomorrow I'm not getting fed. Whether they are knowing inevitably at some point, some tomorrow down the line, my heart is going to stop beating is much more speculative. I can't prove it, but my bet is we're the only ones with a clear sense of it, enough of that to shadow us 24/7.
Okay, so the next question is from Matt from California. What are the neurobiological foundations of racism? Are they found in other mammals too, or just in humans?
Oh, this is such a complicated subject. This is complicated because, from a neurobiological and developmental and anthropological and predopological perspective, racism is deeply, deeply, deeply foundational to our species while simultaneously being totally superficial and irrelevant. Okay, so how do we put, what is it that's deeply foundational about racism in us, in primates, is we have an incredibly strong tendency to divide the world into us's and them's, and to not like the them so much, and to inflate how wonderful we think the us's are, and to be far too altruistic. We do that in a fraction of a second. Kids are doing it by 10 months of age. It is deeply, deeply embedded. And in that regard, I guess unless you're the Dalai Lama, I think there's like you dichotomize the world into us's and them's. Um, where race is superficial is that it's just one of a whole bunch of categories of what are potentially us's and them's. And it's one of many we keep in our heads at the same time, if that is even an us them category. And it's incredibly easy to manipulate us as to changing who counts as a them and who counts as an us. And that could happen in a matter of seconds. In terms of race itself, race is pretty new. It's, I don't know, best estimates are less than 100,000 years old. So that's like an eye blink in hominid history. More importantly, until, I don't know what century, not all that many ago, your average human never met anyone who was from more than 50 miles away from them unless they were Marco Polo or something. The notion of encountering people of a different race is very novel. Race as a scientific concept is suspect. It is a statistical populational thing, but an enormous continuum with arbitrary boundaries, blah, blah, blah. But the biggest sort of point about that is insofar as it is possible to get unconscious us-them dichotomizing along lines of race, it is easy to get people to switch instead. What sort of study? You show a picture of a bunch of people playing pickup basketball, and half of them are white and half are black, and afterward you're asking somebody who watched the film clip, okay, who is it who scored that amazing shot, or who is it who like bit the basketball, or whatever it is, what was that? And just watching them, if someone is likely to identify the wrong person as to who that was, they're more likely than chance to identify the wrong person by race. Oh, you automatically categorize people by race. But then what they do instead is now the same group playing basketball, and everyone's wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt, and it's mixed by race. And now, so who was it who like did that amazing header into the basket there or whatever? Yeah, it was that guy with the red shirt. No, actually, it was a different guy with the red. You recategorize like instantly with that. So race is tapping into our very deep, deep roots about us theming. It in and of itself is a rather superficial one. And not surprisingly, given how long like organisms have been around, sex differences are much, much more fundamentally coded in there. But now we get to like, are we the only species? So let's generalize that question a little wider. Are we the only species that does automatic unconscious us theming and not liking thems, and we're not the only one? This has shown this wonderful, unnerving, revealing test, the IAT, the implicit association test, showing what sort of implicit biases you have. And it taps into the fact that when you're looking at a face of someone who counts as an us, and you're looking at a beautiful picture or a word that's lovely, like trustworthy or generous or whatever, you associate them unconsciously more readily than if you're looking at wonderful words with a them or a picture of an us with negative terms or something. And when you are having to identify which is which, when it is one of the discordant pairings, it takes you a smidgen more time to just process the information, because you're sitting there saying, wait a second, I have this huge, huge prejudice against trolls, and we humans, we're the ones who are trustworthy and loving parents, and trolls are the ones who are schemy and smelly. No, it's not the other way. Troll, lovely, you pause for a fraction of a second to just think about how totally that bizarre that is, and you could pick up that delay. Aha, you have an implicit bias against trolls. So this was a wonderful study done with macaque monkeys, showing them pictures of members of their own group, us's, or strange, yeah, monkeys recognize faces, big surprise. So either an us or them, and then not words with positive and negative connotations, but pictures of stuff. Luscious pineapples versus spiders and snakes and things like, and then pairing them together. And what you saw was the exact same slight processing lag, which is when you put up a picture of a them with a picture of like tropical fruit, the monkey pauses for a second before hitting the right button saying, huh, yeah, right. We're the ones who are like luscious fruit. They're the ones who are like spiders. Weird. Yeah, we're not the only ones who do that unconsciously.
Okay. Someone said, love the series. Dr. Sapolsky, did you discover any new species when trimming your beard?
Um, we're waiting for results. We've got an entomologist on it and a mammologist on it. And all we know so far is they're excited, but we haven't gotten results yet. So we will let you know.
All right, so we've had many people asking about what your favorite books are, as well as mine. So figured we would just go ahead and answer that one.
Oh, favorite books. My favorite books. The 21 Balloons, this kid book I read as a kid 1,000 times. It's got like the most like utopian, unlikely society living on the island of Krakatoa. I wanted to live there forever until the volcano blew up. Another childhood book of mice and men. I read that hundreds of times, and every time I read it, I was a sobbing mess for the last 10 pages, which for some reason had an appeal. Catch 22. It taught me cynicism. It taught me absurdity in high school. And James Glick's book, Chaos, about chaos theory, which I first read about 25 years ago and blew me away and completely changed my thinking about the limits of reductive thinking about science and how we do all sorts of amazing things without having to have blueprints in our heads. So yeah. What about you, Urgula?
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a tough one, but I have a top three, which is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, The Martian by Andy Weir, and A Kitten Called Moonlight by Martin Wadell. Okay. And for our final question of the episode, Lena from Greece asks, the more we understand about the brain and how there's no dichotomy between mind and body, as well as how the subconscious has the lead in our behavior and overall state of being, makes me think that today's psychiatry is not quite catching up with developments in modern neuroscience. Is it fair to say that talk therapy methods of today's psychiatry/psychotherapy are at best ineffective, or at least don't live up to the hype?
Well, we got one of those false dichotomies on our hands here. Ooh, psychiatric disorder. Is it a disorder of psyche and your self-esteem and your affective makeup, or is it a disorder of neurochemistry stuff? And yeah, the obvious answer is it's both. You don't have to choose. The biological components, the more traditionally labeled psychological, social, cultural components are absolutely intertwined, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so wow, can't we all just get along and live in peace and have both views integrated? I think what's most meaningful at this point is, yeah, there's culture is relevant and genes are relevant and neurochemistry and psychological makeup is what's the easiest entry point at this stage for understanding what's going on. Like, if you want to understand why people raised in certain cultures are more likely to have certain types of violence than people in other cultures, you could probably like do a neurochemical study, and that's study sociology and inculcation and things like that. If you're trying to understand like the basis of some neurological disorder, that's the level to go at it. When we get to the sort of middle ground of mood disorders, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, all of that, that's where, just to be forced to make some sort of statement here, you've got roughly equal access to it from the neurochemical medication and from the psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy end. And thus, a huge scientific question is when you have a sudden insight in therapy, what's just happened in your brain? When Prozac has changed something about your serotonin synapses, what's just happened to your thought processes? And those are completely intertwined. And the easy way out of that is what the studies show over and over. If you got a choice, for example, with depression between meds or therapy, absolutely clearly do both because they're synergistically effective.
That is it for episode 9. As always, keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thank you for your continued support of science and the beard.